A mental health professional recently told me something that completely changed how I looked at a story about a young boy who had been forced to take Zoloft as a child. It also made me rethink one of my core assumptions, that modern society is simply too eager to replace discipline with therapy and medication. The story goes like this. I was on antidepressants when I was a teenager. I was still depressed, but my parents insisted that I was better on them. They would say things like, "You're easier to live with when you take your pills." Now, Javier noticed immediately that the question wasn't necessarily whether or not the medication was making him feel better, but rather that the medication was making him easier for everyone else to deal with. And as the story continues, that distinction becomes very important. And over the following months, as he continued to take the medication, he says he developed 4 increasingly difficult problems. And because they appear gradually, he didn't initially connect them to the medication itself. But one day, while waiting for a friend of his, he happened to pick up a copy of the book called The Pill Book and looked up what he was taking. And there they were, plain as day. 3 of the symptoms which he had developed were listed as side effects. And the 4th was listed as very rare, and that was rage. Now, as a disclaimer, nothing in this video is medical advice. If you're having any problems, go talk to your therapist or medical professional. But let's continue. This young man, who I will call Dave, described himself as being angry almost constantly, being enraged. And as a child, this had to be utterly terrifying. Now, most of the time he managed to keep it contained, but eventually that anger had to show itself. And as a result, it caused enormous tension with his family. He started swearing despite previously being so opposed to swearing that he would even say craps while talking about a card game. He says he ended up needing a way to release the anger without hurting someone or putting another hole in the wall. But finding those symptoms listed on his medication gave him hope, because for the first time there was an actual possible explanation for what he was going through. So he went to his parents hoping they would see what he saw. Ideally, they would understand that continuing to take this medication was bad for him and was causing problems. Surely they would see it his way. But as you can probably imagine, otherwise this wouldn't be a story, they didn't. In fact, his mother in particular claimed that they would know when he stopped taking his pills, presumably because his behavior would return to some previous state, which was somehow worse than what was currently going on. Although the doctor that prescribed Zoloft said it would take about 3 weeks before any changes actually manifest. But faced with the continual threat of rage, anger building up inside him, and the desperate need to have some control over his situation, in the face of parents that simply wouldn't change their mind over his prescription, he decided to do something that was deeply against his conscience. Every day I lied to my parents. I hid my pills, I pretended to be the dutiful son, and I was able to deal with the rage and depression just a little more easily, because I was focusing on the end of those 3 weeks. And since I was so scrupulous about telling the truth, to the point of antisocial annoyance, they believed me. They thought my better behavior was because I was finally taking my pills every day. Clearly, he had continued to be the dutiful son that he had always been. And finally, things were getting better because he was continuing to take Zoloft, his medication. And as a consequence, this led to something fascinating. His behavior began to improve. I'll let him tell you in his own words. On day 20, I suddenly woke up to a changed world. The sun was just as bright as the day before, but to me, it seemed better. The air was fresher. My home didn't feel like a prison anymore. My depression was still there, but it felt less heavy. And those other symptoms faded, too. I'd spent almost every day for 2 years wishing for death, but now I felt alive again. Then, about a month after stopping the medication, he finally admitted to his parents what he had done. He told them the truth. Of course, he expected his parents to be upset about the lying, naturally. But he thought that they would be happy that he was doing better, relieved that their son was improving without the need for medication. But he was wrong. They insisted that he start his medications once again. He says, "I argued, I refused, I had tears in my eyes. He would do anything not to return to that living nightmare." But eventually he gave in, still determined to prove that medication was in fact causing the problem. And of course, about 22 days later, the rage returned. And of course, once again, his parents insisted that it was simply because he went on so long without taking pills. But at that point, he was just so filled with anger that he couldn't even form sentences. He couldn't speak. He could no longer defend himself. He describes the rage as so overwhelming that he could barely communicate. And as a result, he decided that no matter what the punishments would be, he wasn't going to take his medications anymore. No television? Fine. No computer? Fine. No going out? Alright, so be it. He didn't care anymore, he just wanted to be free of the rage. A week went by. Nothing changed. 2 weeks went by. His parents would point out that his behavior hadn't fixed itself. Clearly it's because he needed to go back on the Zoloft. Clearly his adamancy to avoid taking his medication was making everything worse. But he pressed on. He refused to bind himself to the medication once again. Every single day, he kept his eye on the goal that one day he would be free. One day he could control his emotions once again. The third week rolled by, and finally, things got better. And shortly thereafter, when they finally returned to the doctor, ironically, the doctor wasn't actually that difficult to convince. And the only thing the doctor found surprising was that, well, he was able to quit it cold turkey without any nasty side effects. She was far easier to convince than his parents. And she didn't have the same fixation or need to force him onto sertraline, or commonly known as Zoloft. Now keep in mind, to this day, he doesn't begrudge his parents. They weren't cruel or abusive to him. But this was still a situation in his life that was very difficult to get through. Now when I first read this story, I thought, this right here, this is the problem with America. This is exactly the problem. A teenager says he has severe depression. His parents take him to the doctor prescribes some medication. Eventually he believes the medication is making him dramatically worse than if he had been taking it in the first place. But the adults, the parents, they don't believe him. It fit almost perfectly with an assumption that I had already about modern health culture. That instead of teaching discipline, changing environments, fixing relationships, or confronting difficult circumstances, we just increasingly reach for therapy and medication. But then I brought the story to someone who actually works in psychiatric care. I assumed she would agree with me. I assumed she would see it as a travesty that I thought it was. Clearly, it has greater implications for American culture. And I'd make this entire video just bashing the West and our need for the quick fix. However, she actually brought something to mind that I wasn't considering. Maybe the problem wasn't the medication or the doctors. In fact, overmedication in particular, which is what I called it, in her experience often looked more like polypharmacy, which is a term meaning people taking multiple medications at once whose side effects and interactions then begin causing additional problems. Basically, a compounding effect. And simply taking an antidepressant doesn't automatically mean that a person is being overmedicated. It's not a bad thing all to itself. And then she gave me an analogy. Suppose someone has high cholesterol. Ideally, they improve their diet, they exercise, they lose weight. And maybe those lifestyle changes are enough to avoid medication entirely. That would be great. That would be ideal. If everyone just worked out the way they needed to, we'd all be slim and healthy. Or maybe I wouldn't drink so much soda. But if the doctor, say, prescribes atorvastatin to someone who has high cholesterol, we don't generally accuse the doctor of overmedicating them, do we? No. The fact that the lifestyle changes might help doesn't mean that the medication itself is illegitimate. The person has a problem, and the medication can help solve that problem. That's what it's for. And when she put it like that, I realized I've been combining two separate things. Using medication and using medication as a substitute are not the same thing. Lifestyle changes are ideal. They're the best solution in most cases. But she also said if someone's condition is serious enough that it requires medication, she generally believes therapy and lifestyle changes should accompany it. Medication doesn't have to replace the work. It makes the work possible. It assists a person in their journey toward wellness. Although she did say she personally prefers lower doses and more limited use where appropriate when it comes to prescribing medications in the first place, because every medication comes with risks. And psychiatric drugs in particular can come with a huge range of possible side effects. So instead of saying our society is terrible because we take medication for everything, I should say, what are we doing to manage conditions that cause the problem in the first place? And are we using medication as a tool or a crutch? Which brings me back to Dave. The parents wanted Dave medicated because he was easier to manage, but upon further explanation, he had extreme depression, and the parents were likely terrified of their child doing something that they could never recover from. That, plus various family problems that he said were going on at the time, likely drove the fear that caused Dave's parents to act in the way that they did. In their mind, Zoloft became the solution to the one problem they could fix, the one thing in their lives that they could control, the fate of their son. And when you look at it that way, it frames the parents not as the source of terror, but rather as the ones seized by terror and driven to act irrationally. To be fair, they were just going by doctor's recommendation on my extreme depression. They also both came around to minimal medication preferences. We had a lot of family problems back then that we've mostly worked through. It took a long time though. Likewise, when it comes to people living in modern society, we should promote medication to be used as a partner in the solution instead of the solution itself. But that doesn't mean they handled it correctly. Not by any means. They clearly should have listened to their son's concerns. Full stop. It should not have gotten to that place. After all, the medication was supposed to have been for him in the first place. But fear can take normally rational people and make them do very irrational things, including not listen to their son when he's telling them that something's definitely wrong. But as for Dave, the story is clear. Medication can be a partner in the solution, but never the solution itself. Unless you're hearing voices, please go get that looked at right now. But hey, if you like Dave's story and you're interested in more discussions about culture, responsibility, and morality, well, you've come to the right place. That's what this channel is about. Hit that subscribe button and check out the rest of my content. But whether you're a returning viewer or this is the first time seeing my content, thanks for stopping by, and well, I'll see you again next time. Bye!